Both bullet spots showing?
Live.
And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island, the naked city, the city of 1,000 stories. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. The mothership at coalitionradio.us, where you will find links to our new podcast, where we've started to roll out on an average about 1 or 2 a day, both current shows, current segments, put in a podcast format so you can listen through speaker, hopefully soon on iTunes and iHeartRadio. And you've also got a link to our YouTube page where you can watch the videos. The point is, we've got about 5 years worth of material that we're starting to dig through. This past week, we broadcast everything from an interview with Dr. Harrop, Mike Riley, at that time, Judge Flanders, recently retired Judge Flanders, recently off of the Central Falls bankruptcy beat, talking about what continues to be prescient. The looming, if you will, bankruptcy of the great city of Providence, the capital city. This, of course, from the campaign of 2014. We put together a broadcast from the Cool Moose himself, one of my favorite shows of all time, Robert Healy, that we recorded in 2014. And in light of both our guests, this tonight, and our ongoing commitment to supporting in whatever we can, the Rhode Island chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union, we're going to continue to rebroadcast a show we call Why You Need to Join the ACLU Now, a comprehensive 1-hour history of the Rhode Island chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union, recorded with Stephen Brown in studio during our Coalition 1.0 days, our digital days on WPRO AM 630. So let's get right down to it. We've got 3 guests tonight. And a lot of the focus tonight is going to be on criminal justice, or should I say justice in the criminal justice system. As I mentioned, for 5 years now, when and wherever possible, we've attempted to support the mission of the American Civil Liberties Union. It is near and dear to my heart. As a young man, I grew up reading the Village Voice, America's first truly independent newspaper. A gentleman by the name of Nat Hentoff, who sadly passed away this year, was their civil liberties beat writer, in addition to covering jazz. Nat's claim to fame, something he took great pride and joy with, was that at one point or another, just about everyone on federal and New York state and city politics hated him. Because much like the vision of the American Civil Liberties Union, his, if you will, his loyalties were placed with the rights and freedoms associated with being an American citizen, or really your natural born rights associated with simply being a human being. One of his seminal books was a book called Free Speech for Me, but Not for Thee, which, talk about prescient. Follow that up 25 years later, it's still topical reading. So, as a function of the American Civil Liberties Union and their mission, again, to maintain civil rights, to maintain constitutional rights for everybody, regardless of what side you are on the aisle, the right, the left, or in our case, the Libertarian Party, the correct side of the aisle. An important part of the system is what I call warrior attorneys. Attorneys who have managed to, through diligent work, effort, and a commitment to the practice of law, operate largely, almost always on a pro bono basis in favor of litigants pursuing their own civil or constitutional rights. The system is largely predicated on that. Your membership of the ACLU goes towards maintaining office, research facilities, a national organization, and probably the hardest working not-for-profit staff here in the city of Providence, here in the capital city. We are blessed in Rhode Island to, I believe, have one of the finest chapters of the American Civil Liberties Union anywhere. They're activist lawyers. When I mean activists, they're not pursuing left or right. They've moved well beyond that. They're pursuing your civil and constitutional rights. So it is with great pleasure from time to time that I'm able to have in studio, or often on the phone, attorneys who I like to ask them to do their victory lap. They've won a case that's important. In many cases, it's taken them months or years of their lives to litigate this case, in addition to running their own private practice, or perhaps at times they've been on loan from one of the larger law firms. regardless of the situation, they are patriots. Very often championing the rights of folks who are, quite frankly, unpopular in the popular culture at that moment in time, or causes that are very unpopular in the popular culture at that moment in time, in the culture wars, as we like to say. Regardless of that, they're doing the right thing, and they're taking their legal training and really putting it to use in a way that I believe is amongst the patriotic acts an American can engage himself in. So, joining me tonight for the first time in studio, she was kind enough to join us on the line a few weeks ago when we were talking about a case revolving around the ACI, is Sonia Dio. Sonia, welcome to the Coalition.
Thanks, Pat.
Sonia is a graduate of the SUNY system. She's a graduate of the Roger Williams School of Law. She's engaged here in private practice here in Rhode Island. She's got an employment law practice that she'll give her an opportunity to talk about. But from a personal perspective, she's deeply engaged in possibly one of the most challenging, at times unpopular, but most important engagement in civil rights you can imagine. On a personal level, as a libertarian, I'm chairman of the Rhode Island Libertarian Party, full disclosure, and as a Methodist, one of the most important political areas of my life is prisoner rights. Again, given the current political climate, not very popular. But if you believe in the divine, if you believe in the ability of folks to resurrect themselves, I'll use the term common with this time of year, if you believe in redemption, then a critical part of the criminal justice system here in the state of Rhode Island or nationally is the ability of prisons to give folks the opportunity to seek redemption, to redefine themselves, to reinvent themselves, to rebirth themselves, literally. And so Sonia's been involved in a number of cases surrounding that, and that's what grabbed our attention. That's why I'm thrilled to have you here tonight. I really am, on a Friday night particularly.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, first of all, tell us a little bit about your journey. You're not a native of Rhode Island.
Nope.
Neither am I. How did you get here, and what brought you here, and talk to us about your legal practice.
All right. I emanate from Saratoga Springs, New York, which is a little horse racing town up in the middle of nowhere.
Home of SPAC,
Indeed.
Saratoga Performing Arts Center.
Indeed.
Grateful Dead, 1983.
I didn't do that, but I certainly jumped a few fences heading in there when I was a kid. And came out here after doing 4 years out in the middle of New York to go to law school. Tried to leave, went to Connecticut for a year, and came back and haven't seemed to find a reason to leave yet. It's a nice little place, 20 years later.
Right. It is a toddling town, as they say.
It is. This is a great little place.
So what's your area of expertise in your day job, if you will?
I am an employment discrimination lawyer. In that, there are a couple of different things that fall in. One is sort of all of the things that go under Title VII, which is discrimination against a person based on their age, sex, orientation, religion, disability, country of origin. So that's sort of one part of the practice. The other part of my practice is enforcing wage and hour laws. You know, where people, a lot of times they're here that don't have proper papers, as they would say, aren't getting paid properly. So bring forth those complaints. But it's also people in sometimes highly paid salaried jobs that aren't getting overtime and things like that. So that is sort of my day job.
How did you find yourself in engaging with the ACLU? I mean, was there a moment in your life where you decided, okay, I'm going to take this expertise that I'm developing and I'm going to spin it around and really engage in some pretty challenging aspects of law?
Boy, Steve Brown called me and asked me if I would get involved with the civil death issue. I don't believe I had directly spoken with the ACLU before, but I had been doing some of the employment discrimination work, so I think that was sort of a natural transfer over. He saw my name, picked up the phone, called me, and here I am 6 years later, 5 years later.
Oh, okay.
I got roped in.
Right. So what, we're going to talk extensively about that because when you explained it to me on the air just a few short weeks ago, I was, like many Rhode Islanders, I think one of the most challenging aspects of fighting this issue is the ignorance amongst the populace of the actual situation, really having a key understanding as to how Rhode Island law works in that respect. But you were also involved in a case just a few weeks ago, revolving around, as I think I mentioned on the air, at what point in time does Rhode Island start put workhouses involved? You've got a situation where you had fundamental heating issues
Right.
in the ACLU.
Right. What had happened is over at minimum security, they're old facilities, and the heating systems that were there began breaking down. And so what happens is we get this call from a gentleman who had been moved over from maximum security because they were in protective custody, and largely isolated from the rest of the population over there, and they're not getting any heat. And we have reports of heat down into the 50s, and the inmates are complaining. They're telling us about how they're taking steps to try to prevent the cold air from blowing into the block and into the cells. And we got involved and were able to set up a system where we could monitor what was going on with the temperature. It became pretty clear quickly that the ACLU, or the ACLU rather, the ACI had taken steps to put in some measures to fix it, at least in the interim. And after that, we dismissed the suit once the weather got a little warmer.
Right. But it strikes me, and I've followed this for quite some time, so I don't know if I'm being fair here or not, but as a more than casual observer, it strikes me that the ACLU is still having to constantly engage with the state of Rhode Island, whether it be quality of life issues for prisoners, whether it be issues revolving around UHIP and Health and Human Services. All of these are fundamentals. There's, as I say, there's not a lot of rocket scientists here. There's not. These are things that they should be doing organically, things you need to know by simply breathing.
I agree with that.
Why then is there this constant give and take with the state of Rhode Island? I mean, almost so many areas surrounding criminal justice system, there is established law and established court precedent already. Why do we think that we can, for lack of a better term, keep screwing with this as a state?
Because absent groups like the ACLU, there's no check. The bottom line is, and I don't want to say people are lazy, but I think when you're talking about allocating dollars and you're allocating staff to a particular issue, I don't think you're going to do that until such point in time as you're aware somebody is paying attention to it and forcing you to do your job. And these, particularly the prisoners, they have no voice.
Right.
They don't have the ability to vote. They don't have the ability to, in real time, contact their representatives or congressmen or anything like that. They can send a letter, right? But what is that really doing for them? So it really does fall on groups like the ACLU to go ahead and try to protect them a little bit. That being said, there is another group here, the Center for Justice, that actually has a lawyer who is there on a one-year fellowship who is dedicated solely to protecting prisoners and their rights. And I think that needs to be noted too, because they are doing some great work.
No, absolutely. I guess what's frustrating, we occasionally run a little segment called City Councils Gone Wild, because this is not just at the state level. There are city councils all over Rhode Island who constantly attempt to redefine, again, established law, whether it be the medical cannabis program, certain zoning issues. And I wonder if at any one time it would be perhaps a worthy project by a college intern to simply round up over a given 5-year period the sheer amount of money that municipalities, quasi state government organizations have literally wasted by engaging these flights of fancy. Because to your eternal credit and the attorneys surrounding the ACLU, you almost always win, and if you lose, there's often, the state has such a black eye because of the ACLU's ability to articulate in a rather dispassionate manner a clear elicitation of the facts, which are often horrific.
Right.
I mean, the state probably didn't cost them any money per se in terms of legal fees, maybe a few hours, this or that, on this most recent case involving heating. But every Rhode Islander woke up to the news one morning, thanks to your efforts, that we're not providing basic heat in the middle of literally sub-zero
Yeah.
weather.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got a, and this is, there's an element of stewardship that's supposed to be involved with regard to governmental functions. You know, you are stewards, if you will, of the people's money, the people's assets. And it's clear, and this is, I'll do this editorial for 2 seconds or less, it's clear that that's not happening because again and again, we had a situation, we had one of your brethren here on the air about 6 or 8 months ago with a situation in Narragansett when they were trying to limit how many people could live in a home who weren't related.
Yep.
The identical, actually, sorry, one person less had been litigated successfully by the ACLU a generation before.
Yeah, and it's the same sort of thing that we're facing right now with the issue I'm here with you before today, on this sort of whether an inmate has their federal constitutional rights and whether they can proceed with them in state court. All right, okay, not for nothing, but that's been litigated in other states. That's been dealt with by the Supreme Court, yet Rhode Island is like, yeah, all right, no problem. We're not going to do that. Yeah, it's baffling to me why that is what happens. I will also say, though, too, that I think as lawyers, involved with the ACLU or not, I think we're all charged to some degree to try to step in and steward the system ourselves. As is the populace, incidentally. We all have a role to play.
Well, if you could give a report card as someone who is keenly aware, but yet somewhat outside the bubble, if you will, of the criminal justice system in this state, and particularly with regard to incarceration. You know, by the way, just as an aside, as I'm driving in, there's Mr. Ferruccio, who is the executive in charge of something called RIPCO, which is the Rhode Island Brotherhood of Correctional Officers,
Yep.
is making a compelling case to try to get some type of transparency on the state's decision to close the Supermax temporarily, to move, desperately challenge criminals into, I'm being exaggerating here to a degree, but into closer into the general population. How would you grade the system here in Rhode Island?
Well, you have to understand I'm a civil lawyer, right?
Right.
So I'm not involved in the day-to-day criminal system where people get locked up. I really do look at this from the perspective of what goes on with civil liberties. And, it's hard to grade. What I can say is that there have been many changes recently. I think back in the late 90s, early 2000, there was much more of a push towards educational programs and
Right.
rehabilitative services, and then that went away. And in some respects, that is starting to come back into the institutions,
Right.
which is a good thing. At the same time, we have issues like there not being heated intake, which is simply baffling to me, or issues where we have reports of prisoners being subjected to just really horrible conditions over at Max, which come on that line of inhumane behavior. And then you've got the whole issue of inmates that are still being segregated 23 out of 24 hours a day,
Right.
both with and without disabilities. And you look at that and you have to wonder, when you've got other states that are meeting these sort of minimum requirements, why we're not.
Right, and as I'd like to point out, and I tease my Republican friends all the time, that there's a Bill of Rights and constitutional amendments that exist well beyond the Second Amendment.
Yeah, well,
and one of them specifically prohibits cruel and unusual punishment.
that would be the eighth.
And we're going to discuss that in just a moment or two. But again, we have a responsibility to two groups of people in that building. Number one, we have a responsibility to the professionals who work there to create an environment that's both safe and professional. And any of these extreme measures do not make them safer, nor does it create a professional environment for them. It just doesn't. So for folks who are fans of this sort of knee-jerk law and order, let's go back to the Middle Ages, it doesn't work on any level.
Yeah.
It just simply doesn't, regardless of how you feel about redemption. And there is no group of individuals under our American Constitution that is beyond having the opportunity to be safe, to live in decent standards, and also have an opportunity for legal help, regardless of their situation, where they are in terms of their incarceration and the education of their particular court case. No one. That's simple. That's a fundamental tenet of our American legal system, and I think we need to remind people of that. Shockingly, yes, we do. And ultimately, most of these people will re-enter "quote unquote" society at some point in time. And congratulations, we'll have really showed everybody if they come out hell-bent for destruction again.
Well, and that's the whole thing. One of the issues with how all of this is being done is sort of the impact you're having on the inmate. For example, you have someone who has a life sentence, which are a lot of the prisoners I'm dealing with. You prevent them from getting married. You make it so it's more difficult for them to re-enter. You have a situation where someone who might otherwise be married and be able to come out to a spouse and come out to a family many times ends up further isolated. So there's that impact. The secondary impact of that is that we know that strong relationships for individuals that stay in prison put them at a place where they're less likely to be violent offenders in prison,
Right.
where they're less likely to cause problems, but we deny that. Going a step further for those individuals with life sentences, what we do is we take away all of their property. We say you can't own anything, you can't have anything while you're sentenced. So they don't even have the bare minimum to come out to. And that is setting up a situation, at least with that population, where you're making it incredibly difficult for them to come out and not be subject to recidivism. Then, and we'll just add this too, you look at what happens when they get parole. Because I was, a few days ago, I was looking at a whole bunch of parole meetings. Believe it or not, they have paroled 16 inmates with life sentences in Rhode Island in the last 16 months. But each of these people have to have a plan to come out. So we're stripping from you the ability to actually have a good, strong family. Oh, but you can't come out unless you've got a plan to have a job, a place to live, and a family to be with.
Right.
Good luck.
We know how that movie ends. we really do. And so, I mean, and to sum it up, and take a moment break to introduce our sponsors, for lack of a better way, and I'm sure you've heard this before, as an outsider, I look now that a death sentence, or I should say a life sentence, is actually a death sentence.
A death sentence might be better.
Literally and figuratively.
Yes.
And I think back a couple of years ago, there was significant controversy about good time regulations.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, full disclosure, I have members of my family who are correctional officers in a couple of states. I have a very close family member who retired from something called the CEA last year, which is the Corrections Educational Association of America, which, as you point out, in the state, now he worked in the state of Connecticut, where there is actually a unified school system that operates completely within the correctional system, with guidance counselors, with, they approach it exactly like a school system.
We don't have that here.
So, no, we don't.
And it's a problem.
Well, and so, like, say, for example, good time law. If you're an outsider and you're just kind of, you watch too many Law and Orders or too many episodes of Oz, you have this bizarre interpretation that good time laws are being weak. When in fact, and I love your interpretation of this, but from what I've spoken to actual correctional officers, most of the CIOs I know are in favor of them because they provide hope for people and they provide a reason to be, quite frankly, well behaved.
That's what you want. I mean, you want well-behaved prisoners, believe it or not. And I think society should be tied into this idea that we want well-behaved prisoners, we want people that are actually rehabilitated to some extent and can come out and actually be productive members of society. So yes, I think the good time laws probably statistically would decrease the amount of violence against some of the correctional officers.
Right.
It's just a wild guess here, but it has to.
Ultimately, at a certain point, if you withdraw hope at every single level for a class of individuals, there's nothing to live for.
It's true.
And it evidenced itself in some pretty destructive ways, as you've seen. I want to take a quick break right now. We're blessed by the appearance of Sonia Diaz. She's an attorney. She has her own private practice revolving around labor law and employment law. She spends a great deal of time engaged with the ACLU and Stephen Brown around, well, I guess, I don't know, would you call it prison law, correctional law? What would you call it? Is it a classification?
I think what I do is called prisoners' rights work.
Prisoners' rights work, okay.
Yeah.
And here at the Coalition, we are profound believers with both the ACLU and, yes, the rights of prisoners. And no, that does not make us weak on crime. This segment, by the way, is brought to you by the fine folks at Yacht Club Soda, yachtclubbottlingworks.com, Rhode Island's premier boutique soda. In business over 100 years in Rhode Island. It was boutique soda before we even knew we needed boutique soda. Natural flavorings, clear, clean water, real cane sugar as opposed to that crazy fructose whatever stuff. Folks, you know, we're coming up on some of the most holiest times of the year, regardless of what religious belief you ascribe to. You're going to be spending a great deal of time with dinner and meals and family. Why not serve the very best? Yacht Club Soda, as we always say here, just say no to the refinery soda, no to those big plastic jugs of chemicals. Enjoy the very best. YachtClubBottlingWorks.com. They are open in their Centerdale location, and they've got distribution all over Rhode Island right now through McLaughlin and Moran. If you go to a store or a restaurant or a tavern or a drinking establishment and they aren't using Yacht Club soda or mixers, well, go to the bartender and say, you know, listen, you prefer Rhode Island's boutique soda. YachtClubBottlingWorks.com, a longtime supporter of the Coalition. As we always say when we talk about our advertisers and supporters, if you're willing to support programming like this, then you really do care about the community. You're involved. And, you know, particularly on shows like this is not easy for a local company and advertiser to embrace. And I give a lot of credit to the folks who support us. Yacht Club Soda, Yacht Club Bottling Works. We'll talk about beacon shipping logistics and, of course, air science. Again, joining me for the first time in studio, the second time on the show, is Sonia Diaz. She is an attorney, a graduate of the Roger Williams School of Law. We're talking about prisoners' rights. Well, we kind of teased it in the first segment. We talked about the notion that a life sentence is a death sentence. You are litigating a case right now where this really brings this to the fore. I can't possibly do justice to this.
Well, hold on. You're under a misimpression.
Okay.
We are litigating this issue. I am not litigating that case. I just want to correct.
Right. Litigating, I should say, an issue that is an outgrowth of an ongoing case. And actually, that person is already been sentenced to a life sentence, correct?
Right. Well, what we've got going on, let me just explain this to you, is broadly, the ACLU is going ahead and putting together litigation to challenge the constitutionality of the civil death statute.
Right.
We've had some other cases before this, and I sent you some materials about some of the work that I've done on this issue. But largely, we are completely and totally against the statute. We are working both up at the House and Senate to try to get it repealed, and setting up litigation to move forward to try to once and for all get rid of this statute. So that's sort of the landscape of where we are.
Right.
As for anything pending right now, there actually isn't.
Okay.
But there's little things that keep going around. On, I think it was Wednesday of this week, we had an order come down from the Supreme Court with respect to one of the prisoners, Cody Allen Zab, who I represented at one point. Zab was trying to have a marriage that he had when he was in prison for life annulled, because the statute itself says you can't get married when you're in prison. And the Supreme Court said, what are you doing before us? You have no right to be here. The only thing the courts can decide on is whether or not you're civilly dead. I mean, that was the decision earlier this week.
Right, and that's why I want you to explain the statute, if you will.
Yeah.
It's stunning.
The statute is stunning. Let me give you some history. The statute was enacted back in 1909. And at the time the statute was enacted, most of the states in the United States had similar statutes already existing. Rhode Island was incredibly late to this party. But the thought used to be that if you had a life sentence, that you should have the ability to get married, your property taken away, all of these other things, because that was sort of the Byzantine way of prison at that time. What's happened is in the last, 70 years, those statutes have largely been repealed, and we are the only state that's enforcing it at this point. New York ostensibly has the statute on the books. It's been held to be unconstitutional. Idaho has it but doesn't enforce it, and then you've got the Virgin Islands. And who knows what they do, but from what I can tell, they don't enforce it either. So it's really Little Rhodey that is enforcing the statute that says that once you are imprisoned on a life sentence, that you lose your right to get married, you lose your right to real property, you lose your right to any property. You lose all civil rights. You can't go before the courts. Basically, you lose everything. You're dead for all purposes. And the implications of that are just sort of crazy.
Right. Now, there was litigation against the prior administration of the ACI, which involved one of your former, litigants.
Correct.
That they were living under inhumane circumstances in the ACI. Here we go again. One allegation was that the steam being emitted from the ACI system was literally causing mold and causing them heavy respiratory distress.
Right.
So real stuff.
Mice.
Yeah.
They won't give them clothes. None of that stuff. And the response, this guy files this complaint in state court pro se by himself, right? And alleges violations of his, state rights under some weird state statutes. I have to tell you, it's not something I would have done. And then he alleges some violations of his federal rights, okay, and state constitutional rights. The state of Rhode Island responds with a motion to dismiss and says, you can't bring the complaint pursuing any of these because you're civilly dead.
You literally have no
You
standing.
you have no right at all. Now,
Right.
here's what you have to understand, is that the U.S. Supreme Court has said no. You absolutely have the right to go ahead, irrespective of what your situation is, and proceed with actions in court to protect your rights under the U.S. Constitution. So that was the position the Attorney General's office took on the issue. All right. Well, all fairness, that's the position the ACI took on the issue. I enter and oppose this motion to dismiss, saying, whatever you're doing here, you can't do this. The statute's unconstitutional 5 ways to Sunday. Oh, and incidentally, the U.S. Supreme Court has said he always has the ability to proceed under the federal Constitution, and they withdrew the motion to dismiss. So it's sort of baffling why the ACI would be challenging the ability of a prisoner to file suit trying to protect their federal rights under the statute just doesn't make any sense. Like, it's clear, it's base law. It's been decided 3 or 4 times. This is not a new thing.
Right. Well, and explain to us the process, like I said, we've all, on our side of the fence, watched way too much TV. And at the end of the 1-hour segment, somehow it's magically declared unconstitutional, and somehow magically, there's a song and dance routine, everybody's happy, and we have the closing credits, and we'll see you next week.
Can we do that?
In Rhode Island, we need closing credits badly. All right, Rhode Island's kind of like a bad game show. Everyone goes home a loser, and there's always parting gifts. But the question here is, first of all, if you hadn't been there, if essentially no one had objected and he was operating pro se,
Yeah.
what possibly could have happened in a case like this? I mean, the state's attorneys, despite what we think are, they're highly qualified attorneys. They know the case law.
Oh, yeah.
Are they just taking a shot just to see if, it's kind of like when you go to a used car dealership, the guy offers you $500 for your trade to see if you take it? Well,
I'd like to believe that, at least in that instance, the attorney that filed the motion to dismiss, at least the federal claims, did not realize they were wrong. I'd like to believe that. But it's concerning, because you should know that. Like, I knew it. When the guy called me, or he didn't call me, when we got the letter and I went in to see him, I looked at him and said, "What? Come on."
Right.
And this is not what I do. And that's the other thing I need to be clear about is, it's not what I do. I know that. So they should know that. These are the prisoners, or these are the lawyers that are representing A.T. Wall and the staff over there.
Right, this is their area of expertise.
They should know this. But what happens if people like me don't exist and that doesn't get raised? Well, they get steamrolled. And really the concern with this, right, and why this is such a major issue in my mind, is because without an inmate being able to go to state court and raise all of the protections they have under the Rhode Island Constitution, if they're denied the ability to go into the federal Constitution for some weird reason, right, they have no rights at all. So all of these life prisoners could literally be raped, beaten, murdered, tortured, starved, not given medical care, denied the ability to research cases.
And by the way, let me jump in. For every one of anyone who's listening say that can't possibly happen here, we also this week had a major announcement from the ACLU talking about the Wyatt Center in Central Falls, where just those very things were happening to the point that the federal government decided to, at a certain point a few years ago, decertify, if you will, their ability to accept federal prisoners.
Right.
So this is not, what you're alleging as potential consequences are not far-fetched. They are happening within driving distance of the studio on a routine basis.
Well, I hope people aren't getting murdered and raped in prison, but I assume some
Prison
of that is
rape
happening.
Prison
It
rape
does
is a
happen.
huge issue in terms of a separate
Yeah.
area of prison law, if you will,
Yep.
and it's a huge problem.
It is. It is. It's just, to me, it's so striking that you have this class of prisoners with life sentences. Now, under the Rhode Island sentencing statutes, a life sentence in Rhode Island is 26 years if you have parole, or the ability to have parole. Then you can go up for parole hearing. So a life sentence isn't a life sentence.
Right.
And for people who were sentenced years ago, it's even less than that. I mean, we've had sentencing reforms to make it longer. But for the most of these guys, they're getting out at some point. You have prisoners who are sentenced to 100-year sentences. One guy was sentenced earlier today to 50 years in prison, 40 to serve. He will do more prison than somebody that got a life sentence in most instances, right?
Wow.
He can get married, he can go to state court, he can protect himself. The guy who gets the life sentence can't, and he may serve less time. Just unbelievable.
Again, I get back to my earlier allegation. It just seems so. I mean, with all of these allegations coming out in lockstep, and this has been going on for a couple of months now. One has this feeling that one's in 18th century England or something like that, or out of a bad movie, but it's reality. So, right now, then, as far as in that case, the state backed off.
Yep.
Because they had to. Are there situations that you're aware of where they've actually used that as a crutch, a legal crutch, and won?
Well, they're winning in those. Let me try this again. They are being successful in negligence cases. If I'm bringing a case and saying that, as a life prisoner, I've had some sort of negligence happen, our Supreme Court is generally saying, no, you can't bring those claims. But those are not the constitutional claims. And in none of those cases has the actual constitutionality of the statute been challenged, which is what we're setting it up to do.
So, one of the challenging aspects from the perspective of the ACLU is that in order to challenge these bad law, if you will, you've actually has to display injury by someone. I would imagine in most cases, someone needs to have suffered from it,
Well,
or is the ability for, again, civilians' terms here, is the ability to gain some type of injunction enough to potentially overturn the law? How do you in court make this law go away if it's in fact possible?
Well, I think that we need a combination of all of the above in our pleadings, which is what we're working on doing. I think that you have to have a bit of an injury that attaches to a person, whether that's an Eighth Amendment violation, a First Amendment violation, due process, whatever. We need something that ties in that brings us into an injury. I think we also need a declaratory part of that. So we have to have this case that sort of goes, you've got a negligence claim or you've got a own personal liberty claim. that would be recognized under Rhode Island state law in addition to all of the federal stuff. I think you need both.
Okay. Or I should say, there's a legislative approach.
Which we're trying. We really have. I mean, the bill has been up there, oh God, at least since 14, maybe 13 even. I have testified in favor of it numerous times. We're not really getting opposition, we just can't get it through.
So it's more the sort of passive-aggressive approach that if you're an activist like I am, is sort of the hallmark, if you will, of the Rhode Island State Legislature. You know, people are afraid to, in one sense, actively fight it, but at the same time they can let the system just sort of eat it alive.
Yeah, if I had $500,000, I think I could get it through.
Who are, if you don't mind me asking, who are your sponsors, or do you have sponsors this time around?
Oh gosh, you can ask me that. I don't remember who they are. You know, they're on the bill. That's a question for Steve Brown.
Okay.
You know, because I'm certain Steve's the one that's, you know, up there banging the bushes to get somebody to sponsor that sort of legislation. It's not me.
Right, you have to have someone with a keen eye to civil liberties and a willingness to absorb the assaults of being soft on crime.
Well, it's not soft on crime. I mean,
Oh,
I'm sorry.
I'm with you.
I'm sorry, but this civil death bill is not soft on crime. I don't think anyone is saying that you serve a life sentence and it should be roses and
Right.
you know, clouds. But this idea that you're serving a life sentence and you know, suddenly because of that, you're losing all sorts of your familiar rights even. Like, you know, if the statute is carried on through, then the person's dead, they don't have any rights to the children, they have none of that. I mean, it's horrible.
Right, and see, but you clearly come from a place where, number one, you understand civics, number two, you understand civil rights, and number three, you've got a keen sense of justice. Unfortunately, in today's political environment, and it's been like this for quite some time, I mean, how do we get 3 strikes you're out? Because you had the mob, you know, using tragedies to push legislative agendas, which then impacted sentencing regulations.
Right.
So when I say it's soft on crime, the accusation, for example, I'm anti-death penalty to my core.
Okay.
On multiple levels, I'm anti-death penalty. It goes against everything I stand for. And people will look me right in my face and say, then if your child dies, then are you going to be happy then? I've had people say that to me because I've testified against the death penalty, and I will do everything I can in civil society here in Rhode Island to make sure that it never happens here. Okay. But that same type of mob rule, you know, which conflates civil liberties with this sort of mob aggression.
But there's a misunderstanding. I mean, it's a
Yeah,
fundamental
absolutely.
misunderstanding is what it is. It isn't that, you know, any of us that are in support of the repeal of the statute thinks, you know, that these people don't deserve to be behind bars and they don't deserve
Right.
the sentences they got and they don't deserve all of those things. It's not that. It's more of a practical, you know, brass tacks. If these people are getting out, we need them to have connections. We need them to be rehabilitated so they don't do it again. You know, you've set up a system where you're going to let them out. We got to kind of try to fix them before we let them out.
Well, and again, it's the mob sense of justice that doesn't think beyond the immediate reaction.
Right.
Right? Great, we showed them. You know, we've turned this person into a bitter, cynical, potentially violent individual, even if their initial crimes may not even have been violent.
Yeah.
They may have been financial. They may have been, there's any one of a number of reasons why you can get a very long sentence in today's justice system. That being said, we allow on a consistent basis in the political side of our justice system to let tragedy impact policy. And we have to stop doing that because there are, I won't even call them unintended unknown consequences anymore. Rational thought, an extension of the situation to see what the possible consequences are, tell us at this point in the year 2019 exactly what will happen if we perform X. And again, 3 strikes you're out is my favorite example of that. Everybody thought 3 strikes you're out was going to be the saving grace back in, what, the 80s? When in fact it led to overcrowded prisons, when it led to a sense of hopelessness, when it actually increased criminality amongst people seeking to evade police, led to the, and 100 different bad things happen because of 3 strikes you're out.
Well, and my favorite example of that is the 23-hour-a-day lockup.
Okay, talk about that, please.
You want to make people mentally ill. I mean, you have mentally ill people that are being locked up 23 hours a day.
Right.
Okay. The impact of that on them psychologically and the ability of them to function and what happens is just insane. It is horrible. We know that. It's been litigated across the board. But the same thing happens with regular prisoners that have disciplinary issues that end up in that 23-hour-a-day situation. So what we're doing is we're making them sicker so that they come out crazier. Well, maybe that's a bad term, but they come out more violent, they come out more angry, they come out with more problems, and then we turn around when they offend inside prison and put them back in 23-hour-a-day segregation.
Right, and this
It's
is a
the worst idea ever.
Right, and this is actually, you and I are talking about a medical, scientific reaction that's physiologically based to 23-hour lockdowns. This is not, they feel bad about themselves. This is not, they're mad because they had a bad week. This is, if you do this, X, Y will happen. It's almost guaranteed.
Right, and I mean, it's a reflection of us as a society stepping back on some of the mental health treatment. So what we have going on is we have people that are being in prison for things when they really need mental help. It's a problem.
And as long as, from the top on down, we conflate public policy with some type of value judgment on an individual leader's ability to discern criminality, civil rights, issues like that, we elect people right now based on emotion. And there is very little attempt made anymore at any level to discern the potential impact of any one of these laws that affect our criminal justice system.
I'll tell you this, I was watching what's going on with the Brexit situation in Britain today, and I was thinking exactly that issue. If we addressed the positions of the parties like I think of what's going on in Britain, because I'm not married to it. It's just, oh, that's what's going on. We could make intelligent choices and take emotion out of it.
Right.
And that's part of the problem.
Well, if you look here in the United States, the war on drugs, boy, we showed them, we arrested them for possessing a plant. The long-term implications of the war on drugs are staggering. For folks who watch this show or heard me testify at this, we call it Mordor up there. I pointed out last week again for the 400th time that the war on drugs increases criminality and has the opposite impact of every single thing that you want to prescribe if you think about criminalizing drugs. It's just, you're doing X to promote A when in fact B cubed is happening. And possibly the most telling part of that is the second report by the Department of Justice as to the underlying causes of Ferguson.
Yeah.
The police state that was put in place to wage the war on drugs had a decided impact on creating an environment where criminality occurred.
Yes.
You drop a bunch of people with tanks.
Yeah, and it's the same thing the ACLU talks about here all the time. I testified on a bill last year about the ability to suspend the registration because of parking tickets. Okay, so what happens? You get a parking ticket, you get another parking ticket, you can't pay the thing, and then suddenly you can't register your car. And then if you drive a car without a registration, you get the car taken away. And then you've got a person who went from a parking ticket to not being able to get to work.
Right.
Over a $15 parking ticket.
I had that same conversation with someone at the Division of Taxation today, who shall go unnamed, who talked about, and I mentioned to him, and he was very polite, didn't respond, but I mentioned to him the lunacy of taking people who owe money in taxes and suspending their license so that if they drive without it, they're criminals.
Yep.
And if the goal is to get people to pay their taxes, we ain't helping.
No.
And in fact, you talk about the prison pipeline in this state. It's we as a state, our entire taxation, our entire motor vehicle code, it seems to be geared towards putting people, taking ordinary citizens, in It's criminalizing them at some level.
Our disability services for students with disabilities, I mean, I'll throw this at you. You have students that have intellectual disabilities that then act out when they're in school. They end up in the truancy system. They end up in a pipeline going from that into our prisons. So, I mean, it goes back further than that.
Wow.
It's not just, I mean, it is a linear line that goes all the way up through.
Right. We, you know, as I like to say in situations like this, we have seen the enemy and he is us.
Yes, indeed. And we're doing a great job.
Congratulations, little roadie. And yet, at the same time, folks here in Rhode Island would think of themselves as, you know, an extension of that shining city on the hill in Boston. And, you know, we are the cradle of American civilization, and we consider ourselves quite progressive in our thought. And yet, on an operational basis, we're a nightmare.
On our actions, we do a horrible job. It's true.
Okay, so I know you're involved in a sense in testifying the legislation. You're not
Yep.
involved in the nuts and bolts of the legislation.
Right.
But if you know, we just got a couple minutes left, and I want to give you a chance again to talk about your practice. If you were going to send a message to Rhode Islanders who might hear this or might hear me talk about it and say, you know, again, that knee-jerk reaction, why is this so important to regular Rhode Islanders who are not part of the system?
It's so important because of one thing and one thing only. We need to stop the cycle. All of this stuff we're talking about is how we create more criminals. When we create more criminals, we take husbands and wives or parents from their families. And when you do that, you're affecting the next generation. You affect their ability to receive education. You affect their ability to operate outside of state assistance. You create situations where they're more likely to need additional services at school. You're just banging on your own tax bill going right on up. You're creating a cycle, and at some point the wheel has got to stop.
Because we literally are the rats on the wheel, right?
We've created it. And you know, it's one little place that could stop. I don't think the civil death bill is going to fix all of it, okay?
Right.
But it's a starting point. And you know, we have to go through and deal with these particular situations one at a time and try to fix them. I mean, that's sort of what we all should be doing as stewards of our own system, right?
Right.
But that's what we have to do. You got to start chipping away, because if you don't, you continue to perpetuate the problem.
I hope you'll keep us up to date. I know Stephen will, hopefully, on the progress of this bill. This is the challenge if you're an activist, and I can speak to this personally, is that right now there are a couple of thousand pieces of legislation that have been generated just in this session.
Yep.
So the organizations I'm involved with a couple of people have kind of stepped aside. Okay, let's try and figure out a way to either automate it or so that we can actually respond through this sort of sea of bills that are, you know, being thrown at us, just dumped on us minute by minute,
Yep.
and try and understand what is it that we have to pick from literally the needle in the haystack. And it's so difficult because, you know, for example, last year our group missed out on the if you will, you've got the prescription medical database in the state.
Yes.
And, you know, it's the then Attorney General, who shall not be named, decided that it was a good idea that police wouldn't need any sort of legal service or legal process to be able to obtain access to this. No warrants. We don't need those stinking warrants, right?
No, not at all.
And all of a sudden the bill passed. Because meanwhile, you know, in my case, I'm fighting against a baseball stadium, and other people are fighting against this and that. It's legislative whack-a-mole, and I've become so cynical as to the process that I truly believe it's intentional. Just to keep throwing it out, and every year, something, a DNA database, something, you know, the ability to call something a memorandum and to then be able to obscure any sort of legal access to it
Yep.
for activist groups. The situation in our next segment we're going to talk about where, you know, normal records now have to be sourced. You have to have a true application and go through all sorts of legal proof in order to gain the most basic information about the behavior of a police in our society.
Yep.
You know, everything. This isn't a coincidence, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I truly believe there are elements in the state government. I'm not going to ask you to comment on this because I know you practice law before them, but there are elements in this community, in the government, that are hell-bent on incorporating these facets into everyday life. It can't be happenstance, it can't be circumstance.
No, and they're trying to grind us down.
Step by step.
Yeah, yeah, that's it.
And if I can come full circle, it's good people like you, and we've had a couple of dozen. We've been blessed that lawyers like you do two things. Number one, you take an enormous amount of time from your personal life and your professional life to either litigate or research cases like this, and you're willing to come on, public affairs shows like this to talk about it, and to which I can only say we are profoundly grateful.
Well, thank you for having me.
Because as tough as the situation is here, I shudder to think what civil life would be like in this state and in this city and where we're sitting right now if it wasn't for the volunteer attorneys surrounding the American Civil Liberties Union. It would be,
And I shudder to think what it'd be like without Steve Brown.
right.
Because not for nothing, he is generally the person that is the battery power behind all of this.
Oh,
That man is phenomenal.
tireless. I've been up there 3 or 4 times in the last 2 or 3 weeks. Depending on what side you are of a particular civil liberties issue, there is very often a concerted effort to vilify Stephen Brown. Mm-hmm. Just the sheer physical commitment he has to the rule of law, to civil rights, is astonishing. I've been up there at 10, 11 o'clock at night, and I'm tired. And, he's managing all of these disparate situations.
Yep.
And he's up there testifying constantly. And his testimony's on point, it's articulate, and the range of bills with which his group, and it's a small office,
It is.
is able to corral just on a sheer intellectual level is astonishing. So.
Yeah, he is amazing.
Tell us once again how folks. Let's get back to you've got a private practice here, and
I am the straight shooter.
I love that.
You can find me. You can find me online. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a big promoter of my practice. I got enough business. But what I will say is this. Certainly everywhere on the internet, you will find me. Mm-hmm. And, we do employment and discrimination work. And, if you have wage and hour problems, come on in. We'll take care of you.
And there's only a handful of very good employee law, labor law practitioners in the state. We're blessed to have them because I've been in a situation where I've needed someone like you.
Yeah.
And without folks like you on a professional level, stepping aside from the ACLU involvement, it is very difficult in a state like this to gain justice as an employee.
But that's the other reason that people like me exist, is, again, to enforce those sort of laws. I mean, it all goes together, sort of how I was brought up. It's what we do.
God bless you.
Yeah, well,
Thank you very much.
thank you. And
All right.
keep going with the show.
All right, well, listen, Sonia Dio, as in Ronnie James. Sorry. She can be found on www.the-straight-shooter.com. Folks, you out there, when you hear this, you need to understand, support the lawyers who are willing to, in their own personal life, support you. That's all I'll say on that matter. And thank you so much very much.
Am I free to go?
You're free to go. You are no longer being detained.
All right, happy Friday night.
All right, thanks so much. Folks, we're going to take a quick break right now. We're going to spend the next hour talking about yet another developing ACLU situation. As the saying goes, in the halls of justice, justice is often in the halls. And while we have a government that gives a tremendous amount of lip service, if you will, to transparency, the most abused word of the year 2018/19, you have a state and a municipal set of governments that are hell-bent to provide anything but transparency. If we as a society are to trust, if you will, in our legal system, our law enforcement community, then that transparency must exist. And you're about to hear of a situation where, again, government simply wants no part of any of you understanding their rationale, their behavior, Tragic. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, deep in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island, the naked city, the city of 1,000 stories. We're telling a few of them tonight. Pretty provocative stuff. In our first segment, Attorney Sonia Diao talked about basic human decency and the living conditions surrounding, if you will, the facilities that we house and warehouse people in as part of our criminal justice system. And the outright attempt by your state government to deny them even the most fundamental legal rights in courts of law. Folks, we're not making this stuff up. This stuff isn't happening in some third world nation, some Eastern Bloc country. In the last few weeks, you've had the ACLU rise up against, again, the housing of federal prisoners right here at the Wyatt Detention Center. You had the American Civil Liberties rise up against the inability or the decided failure of the Adult Correctional Institute to provide heat. You've had the ACLU, again, had to rise up to point out that a segment of our prisoner population is in fact not civilly dead. They are alive and well, and they are entitled to the rights and treatment of the American criminal justice system and judicial system, just as any other living body in this country are. And you're about to find out how there's a certain segment of the criminal justice system that clearly feels that they can operate without the watchdog eyes of private citizens groups who are only intent on justice without their watchful eyes. Folks, stay tuned. We'll be right back.